session called E-commerce Maximizing Benefits Through Regional Multilateral Rules, which is timely given the discussions that are happening right now as we speak at the WTO level. We have with us, first of all, well, I'll go in order, Ambassador Julian Braithwaite from the Permanent Mission of the UK to the WTO, Jake Colvin, Executive Director of Global Innovation Forum and Vice President of Global Trade, Ibrahima, Diagne, Chairman of the African Performance Institute, Deborah Elms, the Founder and Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center. We have Ady Porges, who's a Principal Law Offices of Amelia Porges, and finally Mark Wu, Assistant Professor at Harvard Law School. So, would like to start this session with a brief introduction from each of you about the topic that you will cover in the next round of short presentations, and of course your immediate comments about what's happening this morning and what we know, because nobody seems to know exactly what went on, and what are some of the thoughts that is triggering to you. Ambassador, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me this morning. And I mean, I think coming to the point that you've just made, which is what's actually going on in this MC11 WTO ministerial, where e-commerce is supposed to be one of the issues being discussed, one of the outcomes. And what I think, if we're looking at the challenges of how you maximize the benefits of e-commerce through regional multilateral rules, this week is demonstrating exactly what those challenges are, in that e-commerce, at least in the multilateral system, has suffered from being often held hostage to other issues that are being negotiated in the WTO. So there's been this linkage, if you like, between finalizing the issues in the Doha round, the agricultural issues in particular, and moving on to issues like e-commerce. And the fact that there's no progress or little progress on the agricultural side means that things like e-commerce get stuck. So that's one of the big challenges, is that linkage that's been going on for a number of years. And the other one is a sort of a conceptual one, which is that for many, there's a sort of strand of thinking, of developing country thinking, which is that actually having multilateral rules of e-commerce is premature, that would somehow lock in the benefits for developed countries and for their global internet players, and therefore actually you need to resist multilateral rules on e-commerce. Now, one of the things that ICTSD and indeed many other organizations in Geneva do outside of the WTO is actually demonstrate the enormous development benefits of e-commerce and bringing those arguments into the WTO and allowing those arguments to break down this binary division that you often see in WTO negotiations is actually critical to unlocking the benefits for e-commerce in the multilateral system.
Thanks, Ambassador. Jake?
So maybe to pick up on that, I think one of the things that we're really excited about as we sit here with the notion, at least, that a number of countries will come together and agree on a joint statement for future work on e-commerce, is that sort of exactly what Julian just said. This sort of initiative helps to align developed and developing country interests, and I think sustainable development and business interests. For as long as the WTO has existed, the kind of predominant narrative around development was that developing countries shouldn't have to do anything at the World Trade Organization, or they should get special and differential treatment. I think what's refreshing is you have a not insignificant group of developing countries who have taken it upon themselves to say that making commitments and having high standards and having interoperability and access to the global digital marketplace is good for their economies and good for their small businesses and good for their development. And so that's been really inspiring to me. I will say, I mean, well, we'll see what actually gets announced today. But we came into this ministerial probably not super optimistic about outcomes for anything, even on a plurilateral outcome. I mean, I sit in Washington, D.C., and so our government has been quieter than normal on issues where where the United States would normally take the lead. And so I think it was an open question as to whether or not the United States would say anything positive about e-commerce. I think we're encouraging them to do so, and if they do, I think that would be very, very positive as well.
Thanks, Jake. Chairman Diagne?
Yes, thank you. So I will develop during this session about the e-commerce. In the beginning of the concept, the commerce was larger than the E. But now we are in a situation where the E is larger than commerce. The impact of technology on trade is very, very important. And for developing countries, the capacity to handle those technology to develop trade is very critical. I will give a simple example. The most way of doing e-commerce in Senegal, in my country now, is through Facebook. So people are just using Facebook as a network because we have a lot of, maybe 50% of the population of my country has a Facebook account, and this is the way they are doing e-commerce. But the data of this e-commerce, the information about what they want, when they want it, the colors they prefer, and whatever, those information are not available in the country. So the government has no statistic about the e-commerce, but Facebook has it. So this is a very big challenge about big data, where it is located. And for developing countries, this is where I think the discussion on e-commerce has to focus on, because if you don't have the data, you don't know what your people want, so the development of e-commerce can be very critical. And I will develop further on if e-commerce is a danger for African countries, as it will erase the value of trade they have already, or it is an opportunity as it will help to increase the value of trade they will have. So this is my main concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Deborah?
Well, at least in Asia, e-commerce is an enormous opportunity, and it's especially an enormous opportunity for SMEs. And one of the reasons why it's been a opportunity is that we have governments that largely up until now have been favorably viewing e-commerce and digital trade. And they've done so bilaterally, locking in certain kinds of things in bilateral agreements and also in regional agreements, which has been excellent, and we can talk about that more in a minute. But one of the challenges that we've had is that e-commerce, and especially digital rules, digital itself, has no boundaries, right? It doesn't know where an agreement stops and sort of says, okay, well, that's it. We're sort of, we've hit the edges of our agreement, and now everything else is, wilderness or something. So we really need to have multilateral rules that provide the framework for this, because when you are a company and you're buying and selling digital goods and services, you need to have multilateral frameworks in place. You can't just count on regional agreements, because your customers, your suppliers, whatever, are global. They're not regional necessarily. So we really do need to have the WTO have a comprehensive framework in place. Now, that is going to be very difficult to do, especially when not everyone seizes the benefits and the opportunities from this environment that we're operating in. So I hope that the WTO moves forward on this, and I hope that the plurilateral part is as big as it can possibly be, because that is when the benefits actually accrue, especially to small firms who, again, have no ability to say, well, this country is in the plurilateral and this one is not. For a company, they just assume that everybody must be in whatever those rules happen to be.
Thanks. That's interesting. Looking forward to discussing it further. Amy?
I'm thinking about this morning, I'm really quite struck by how much this issue has changed since the first time I started tracking it 15 years ago. 15 years ago, we were in we had gone from a mainframe world to a PC world. But we were still in a world where it was really the biggies who were pushing for this kind of idea. There was very little low participation, low sense in the WTO that people had something to gain. 15 years later, today, we've moved from the mainframe world, from the PC world, now we're in the mobile phone world. And everybody has something to gain. I think the people who are buying and selling on Facebook aren't doing it from a computer, they're doing it from their phones. In developing countries, Mobile broadband has long since outstripped fixed broadband. But you know, what's powering the stuff? It's really the data. To access the internet through your phone, which is how the next billion are going to get online, they're going to have to, they are uploading data to the cloud where it gets aggregated and processed, and then it gets downloaded again to the phone. And that requires there to be a data center somewhere, cloud somewhere, and processing. And it also fundamentally it does involve moving data across borders. So, and let me also mention that the cloud, the infrastructure for all that is large, it's fixed, it's expensive, and it requires a level of certainty, which goes back to what Debbie's talking about. Businesses like certainty when they're going to make an investment like that, and that's why multilateral rules that cover everybody are so useful.
Thank you. Mark, would you like to make an introductory statement?
Sure, thank you, Ady, and good morning, everyone. I want to focus this morning on some work that I did with ICTSD and the RTA exchange. And basically, the analysis that we did was we took the 70 RTAs with either an e-commerce chapter or with some form of substantive digital trade-related provisions, and we analyzed the components on each of those. And I'll highlight two main findings here, and then I'll discuss those in greater depth later during my intervention. The first is there is this common belief that this is the large advanced economies plus a set of friends that are driving this type of agenda. But if you actually look at who's committed to this some form of digital trade provisions in RTAs, it's more than half of the membership. So there is a critical mass of countries that have engaged with this. Not all of them are going to necessarily be on board with the continuation of some form of working group discussion, but the message to those who are on the outside is the world is moving forward in terms of shaping rules on this, regardless of whether you like it or not. And so it's imperative upon you to figure out what's in your national interest in this emerging world. The second point, though, is that if you look particularly among the large advanced economies, there is actually quite a bit of heterogeneity amongst those countries. And this tees up some important policy questions as to how you wish to structure any form of a multilateral agreement going forward on this, even if it's done on a plurilateral basis. There may be some issues that need to be resolved. And if not, we can have a web of regional, which is what we have and we see building out, and that's what we are tracking.
Thank you, Mark. Because of the approaches that you expressed so far, I think it would be useful to start with Amy. You have an insight on the effect of e-commerce in sustainable development and why they are important for RTAs, for agreements in general, to include them. And I guess that would be a good place to get the discussion going. So why don't you?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, what is the future in e-commerce? For developing countries, it's people buying and selling and checking crop prices and getting information that they need, and they're getting it through their mobile phones. That's it. I mean, and those mobile phones are sending data to the cloud where it gets aggregated, processed, and then distributed down. And then, but my particular interest here is, again, the issue of data mobility.
Yeah.
And server localization. Because not every country is a big country. Some countries are small countries. Some countries have to have they have to be served not by a gigantic data center in their own country, but by the country next door. And it if you have an internet made of data silos, it's not going to work. It's certainly not going to work for the users or for the companies. So this idea of data mobility is not a new idea. Already in the Uruguay round, the negotiators had the understanding on commitments in financial services, which had a commitment that no member shall take measures that prevent transfers of information or the processing of financial information, including transfers of data by electronic means where such transfers of information or processing are necessary for the conduct of the ordinary business of the financial service suppliers. So, right, banks and insurance companies have been transferring data for hundreds of years internationally, but instead of doing it by horse, today they do it electronically. And rapid information transfers are essential to their business. So this is a reference paper, obviously. The commitments under the GATS are subject to the exceptions. This is not an unlimited right. It's subject also to the prudential carve-out. And so I'm thinking about what the WTO might learn from regional trade agreements. Obviously, the U.S. has been negotiating free trade agreements with e-commerce chapters since the Singapore-U.S. Free Trade Agreement in 2001. And starting in 2005 with the Korea-U.S. FTA, there was a non-binding pledge to endeavor to refrain from imposing or maintaining unnecessary barriers to cross-border information flows. And then in TPP, you had the e-commerce chapter, which turned out to be a huge selling point for the TPP. Nobody was opposed to it, and I believe that the e-commerce chapter of the TPP 12 has been completely untouched and will go into force with the TPP 11, when the TPP 11 goes into force. So this includes two provisions on data mobility. Article 1411 requires the parties to allow cross-border transfers of data by electronic means for the conduct of business of a covered person. So that's service suppliers, investors, their investments, and that covers basically manufacturing businesses. Seriously, distributed factories and global value chains need free cross-border transfers of data. In fact, if you can't have transfers of data, small businesses in developing countries are not going to be connected to those value chains that they need in order for their countries to grow. Then there's also another provision that says parties have to allow a covered person to do business without being required to use or locate computing facilities in that territory. So, you know, this covers, and these are not absolute rights, they're balanced. The governments still have the right to restrict data transfers or impose server data localization requirements if they're adopted for a legitimate public policy objective, and if the measures are no greater than required to achieve the objective and are not applied in a manner that discriminates or is protectionist. This is a reasonable balance. And they're also tied to a regulatory package. The same chapter requires every TPP party to adopt and maintain some kind of framework providing for data privacy, protection of data privacy, so users' personal information. Not imposing one model of that, but you just have to have some kind of data privacy protection framework. And you have to have effective measures to protect consumers from online fraud, anti-spam measures, and there are separate provisions in the financial services chapter on data mobility, which are, again, subject to the prudential carve-out there. So these are not absolute rights, they're balanced rights, they're reasonable rights. And they're very, I think they're very constructive for the development of the future internet economy to connect the entire globe, including small and medium businesses and farmers in developing countries. I've seen, these were very popular. These are not unique to the United States or the TPP. There's something in the Mexico-Panama FTA I see in your paper, and they may be, in fact, taken up in the Pacific Alliance at some point. And this was proposed in TISA. I certainly hope there will be a TISA in the future and that this will be in it. So let me leave it there for that. And let me just mention one last thing, which is non-discrimination. In these FTAs for the U.S., again, starting in the Singapore-U.S. FTA, there was a long argument in the WTO about whether digital content, e-books, software, digital video, digital music, are these a good or are they a service? And this was an argument that lasted forever and never reached a conclusion. in these other FTAs, basically the FTAs have basically said, are they a good or a service? And the answer is yes. Or there's something else. They've invented another category called digital products. And they've had separate provisions which provide a non-discrimination clause for digital products. And they also made the e-commerce moratorium permanent for digital products traded between the parties. I think that too is a very constructive and effective idea. It's been much more widely taken up in FTAs than the data mobility provisions, which are more recent. But again, this is, again, very, very much worthwhile for consideration as perhaps you have a plurilateral group starting a conversation about what rules might be like in the WTO.
Thank you, and that's one of the questions we'll ask Ambassador Braithwaite in a minute. I'd like to hear your perspective, Deborah, on the TPP and the negotiations there, and then I'll ask Jake also to a take on the U.S. perspective in those negotiations. But why don't we start with you, Deborah, about it?
So I think Amy's done a very good job of describing the TPP rules that are in the e-commerce chapter. But I think that the e-commerce friendly part of the TPP goes beyond just chapter 14. So if you just looked at that, you would say, well, that's fantastic. Yay. But I think it's deeper than that, actually. So if you're an e-commerce player, a small firm, big firm, whatever, or if you are in digital services, there is a lot more in the TPP that is important to you, and the TPP is coming soon, so all of you skeptics in the room can stop being skeptical. Should be signed by the parties in probably March, and will come into force next year, actually, as soon as 6 members or 50% of the signatories sign, and so that could be certainly within, by next year, if we were all to meet again next year, we would have TPP active, I think, and into force. And on the day of entry into force, all of the digital stuff, especially, all of the e-commerce provisions are active on the very first day of entry into force. It's an amazing agreement, the way in which it comes into force. So if you're an e-commerce player, what happens to you? All tariffs drop to 0. And most of those tariffs drop to 0 on goods on day 1, and the rest of the tariffs drop to 0, particularly with the United States out. The United States was an outlier with its 25-year time horizon on pickup trucks. Most of the tariffs for the other 11 drop to 0 very rapidly as well, within, in most cases, 3 to 5 years. So if you are an e-commerce player, you are now looking at a tariff-free world on every single product, with very, very few exceptions. So cream cheese into Japan still has a tariff on it for as far as the TPP can predict. But other than that, everything is 0 tariffs. So as an e-commerce player, that's fantastic. Every single product, including every parts and components, every part of your supply chain, everything that a small company might ship somewhere is 0 tariffs. The rules of origin apply to all TPP countries. So once you manufacture a product, you can ship it across all TPP countries without remanufacturing. The customs provisions make it very easy for you to ship goods because you have, I won't get too technical and down in the weeds, but you have the ability to ship things without even a customs declaration, because you can, if you're a qualifying firm, you can self-certify that these meet the rules of origin. So this is, again, fantastic news for big companies, small companies, et cetera. I think this is going to facilitate trade in the e-commerce space. A lot of companies, though, especially a lot of small companies in the digital world, supply services. And one of the challenges that services providers have is that our services commitments in general are always weak, especially the ones that I look at in Asia. We often open up for services in an FTA, services that no one cares about. So I always joke that in Asia, we have services for space travel and tourism are opened. All the space travel you want, freely available. We have travel, we have openings for, you can deliver food by bicycle. That's one of the ASEAN commitments. So yay, if you want to be the Uber of bicycle delivery, fantastic, good on you. But you can't deliver it by car, this is ridiculous. If you want to open up hotels, fantastic, 2-star and below are now open for you, not helpful. But TPP, by contrast, every single service sector, all 160 subsectors are open for services and open for investment. And it doesn't matter what method of delivery you use. So if you want to deliver those services digitally, fantastic. If you want to deliver them through whatever mechanism we come up with 10 years from now, fantastic. This is every single service sector, including medical services, construction services, back office services, accounting services. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is can now be delivered across the TPP-11. For a lot of companies, this is massive. This is where, especially for SMEs, this is where they actually are. They sit in the services section. So they can deliver it online, they can deliver it mobile, they can do however they deliver things. I don't know what the next new thing will be, but whatever it is, carrier pigeon, you name it, you can deliver it that way. That's fantastic, without having to have a local presence. Because many places that open up a service then require you to have a local presence. This undermines it completely. So TPP has no local presence requirements. They prohibit performance requirements for investment. So there is like more than 20 local performance requirements that are prohibited in the TPP. So there's a whole lot of extra things besides just that e-commerce chapter that add up to giving huge benefits for e-commerce and digital services players, both large and small, in the TPP that are extremely important. If you don't have all of that other stuff attached to the movement of data, then you really haven't opened up e-commerce and digital services. You've opened up one key avenue, because if you don't have access to data, if you don't have access to information, then you're stuck at the starting line. You're already stuck. But even with access to information and access to data, you can't actually move goods and services if we haven't opened up goods and services movement in an FTA or in a regional agreement. So TPP does that. Other FTAs in Asia do that to a lesser extent because they're not quite TPP level. But I think that's what makes TPP so interesting, and especially when we look at sort of next generation trade rules, TPP is quite fantastic for e-commerce and digital trade. Does it solve all of your problems? Of course not. No trade agreement is going to solve all of your problems. But if you are an e-commerce player, large or small, I think this is the one that is going to set the benchmark, at least in Asia, for some time to come.
Thank you. And Jake, I guess we can talk about the importance of e-commerce. I guess one question, in your opinion, what did the U.S. or would it miss out by leaving the TPP, and how can you actually call it recover or get even the next time you negotiate an agreement like this outside of the TPP area, I guess?
Well, I think Debbie did a great job of emphasizing all of the reasons why the United States belongs in this agreement and is missing out by not being part of the agreement. I mean, I think there is strong support among the American business community for, at the time, passing TPP, but now docking into TPP at some point. It serves as the gold standard for all the reasons you just said, for free trade agreements and for e-commerce provisions within a trade agreement. It's not the highest gold standard, and I think there are areas where, as we look at the negotiations of the World Trade Organization, the potential for negotiations of the World Trade Organization, and other forums that we're either a part of or we're not a part of, like the Pacific Alliance, like ASEAN, like APEC, where we can even elevate the standards that are in TPP. And so, you know, one of the deficiencies in TPP was not extending the e-commerce provisions on data flows and server localization to financial services, and I think that can be improved. We didn't manage to get a de minimis level in the TPP, and I think you know, we and our businesses have been making a strong case for high de minimis levels, as we have in the United States right now, to enable small businesses to trade internationally with as little red tape as possible. There could even be enhanced SME provisions. You know, all these are best practices in the SME chapter, but you know, we would advocate for kind of sharing of best practices and programs on things like export and investment promotion programs for small businesses. The UK does a fantastic job of this. Chile does a great job of this. Argentina is increasingly doing a great job at this. And so an ability to create a forum through a trade agreement to share best practices and orient the services that governments already provide to small businesses, I think that would be tremendously helpful. we continue to be disappointed that we're not a part of TPP, but I do think that there are opportunities for the United States to engage in a positive way here at the WTO on e-commerce and in other forums around the world. So,
thank you. And so, I guess, Chairman Diagne, now that you've heard issues both present and missing in Asia, the United States, what's your perspective on some of them in Africa, how the e-commerce development is affecting African countries, and what's the outlook for them?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, the African context is we're in a situation where e-commerce is now taking off because we have the business concept available, we have the technology available, but also all the services as e-payment and so on. So we are in a situation where the e-commerce is picking up. But the challenge is that the value was at e-commerce, because the current situation of trade in Africa is that we have very low intra-African trade, and also we contribute in a very low manner in the global commerce. What e-commerce will bring, we are not sure that it will improve the situation of trade, because we are in a situation where the value of trade, when we talk about services, for instance, if you want to, if I want to book a room, I said yesterday, I want to book a room in my own country, maybe I will do it through Expedia platform or another platform. So where is the values? Because the hotel I want to book is just 100 meters from where I'm sitting. But because I don't have a big platform, because in my context, there is no capacity to have the big data information available and to target me, I will be targeted by Expedia, and this is where the value will stay as the trade is inside my country. And this challenge can be also considered when it will be within African countries, because it's the same situation. When you are traveling to another African countries, probably you will buy a ticket somewhere where the value will not stay in Africa. You will pay the value in another big platform worldwide, because there is no big African platform. Why there is no big African platform? Because the market of Africa is split by many countries, 54 countries in Africa. Now we have a new free trade agreement for all Africa to be only one single market. This is a political decision. But the time it becomes a reality on the market, we know that it can take a lot of time, because there is many regional agreements in Africa, but customs still at the borders, meaning that the countries, they have the political declaration, they want to constitute one integrated region, but they don't trust each other because they need custom at each border. So with that situation, I'm afraid that with the e-commerce being very facilitated, so people can exchange very smoothly, and then the African has no capacity to capture the value of the e-commerce trade. If we are not capturing that value in Africa, it will erase everything that can be expected on trade, because trade is a very productive manner to reduce poverty. But this e-commerce, if the African government are not strategic, and this is my message, African government need to be strategic. The e-commerce will be not a benefit for Africa if there is not a strategy, as China did, because yesterday I was in a session, but China has taken the concept of e-commerce. China is a giant of commerce. But even in e-commerce, there is a strategic approach for e-commerce to be also a potential for the Chinese economy to grow again more and more. And if in the African context, the government just want to say, okay, let it be, like it was in the US, but the US has a very big market, and the market was ready to make e-commerce a benefit for its own country, and now expanding, being global, because most of the major e-commerce players are from the US, and another big player are in China. In other countries, in Asia and maybe in Latin America, you have maybe some big players. But in Africa, the e-commerce I'm observing now is the e-commerce with very small micro enterprises trying to make local e-commerce, even not nationwide, but local in the city. This is very good. But the e-commerce we are talking about here, and that the country need to negotiate on, the African players are maybe not ready to engage those discussions because they don't know where their interests are. And this is very critical for them to understand. And as I say in my initial statement, as we go, as the technological aspect of e-commerce becoming more and more important, and the commerce becoming less and less important. So we are going to discuss on the perspective of commerce of a matter where technology has more importance than the commerce itself. And I think that we need to shift on a new way of considering the e-commerce and be sure that for the African region, it will be a benefit and not another way of erasing the value of trade and increasing poverty in Africa.
Thank you. Deborah, you have a comment?
I just had a very quick comment.
Okay.
Because we just did a white paper and a policy brief, actually, on online travel agencies. And so I had a reaction to your comment. I would say the value actually stayed in Senegal. Why? Because you booked a hotel that you might not have known about. I could book a hotel in Senegal, right? So I could be sitting in Singapore, I book a hotel in Senegal. How in the world would I have found that hotel absent Expedia? Not only would I have booked that hotel, but it's entirely possible that as I'm booking that hotel, I'm also booking associated services. I'm booking, while I'm booking that hotel, I'm booking a car rental. I might be booking a tour. I might be booking a safari. I could be booking a cooking class. I could be booking a whole lot of ancillary services on that website, which I would never have known about from Singapore had I not had that online travel agent experience, finding me those local players that make me say, oh my goodness, that's where my next vacation is going to be. So I think absent e-commerce and those services and that platform, I would never have come to your country. I would never have found that hotel. I would never have found any of those additional services. So I think the value is staying in your country.
Maybe
Guys,
just
I know this is going to take the rest of the
No, just
conversation.
1 minute.
People in the room may have a lot of comments and questions, and I'll get back to
Can you
this
allow me 1
conversation.
minute? Just?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. What you are saying is right. But I'm just saying that the value, because when you book an hotel in Expedia, they are taking a commission.
That may
no,
be.
Please, let me finish. Then the commission is not, if the hotel in Senegal was $100 a night, Expedia will pay $70 and will keep $30 in the US. When you book the car, it's the same. So the normal cost of the service, I'm not saying that we should not make any e-commerce, but we have to own the platform that will allow you to book in my country, Safari, car, and so on, for the 30% margin, stay in the country. And I will give you a very simple example. When I book hotel in Paris, because I used to travel there, every time I use Expedia, when I arrive in the hotel, they told me, please, for the next time, just book straight in our website, and we will give you a discount, because we don't like to pay the commission to Expedia. This is how it's working. And I just want to say that if Africa, all the commission, all the interest of e-commerce is staying out of the country, we are missing a part of the value that should stay there. This is what I would like to clarify.
And we can continue the rest of the week, if you want, discussing this.
Exactly.
But before turning into the people's questions, I think we have like one other line of topics to cover, which is Professor Wu's research on conversions in regional trade agreements, and then we can hear from Ambassador Braithwaite about how you can bring those RTAs into the larger global WTO playing field. So Mark would like to hear on your research, and then Ambassador will take it to the global level. Please.
Sure. Very quickly, on the research, we took the regional trade agreements and we broke them out into 5 different dimensions, and then within each one of these, there are sub-dimensions. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. The paper is available on the RTA Exchange website, and you're welcome to download it. And we will try to update it with iterations over the course of time as more regional trade agreements come online. But let me highlight a couple of points from these regional trade agreements, right? There is clearly a set of non-controversial, what we would think of as basic principles types of issues that we can find in most of these agreements. The standard trade, non-discrimination principles, lowering of customs duties or some form of customs duties moratorium. Some of them cover services, but these very basic types of principles. And then also what we might think of as basic e-trade facilitation. So issues around authentication, signatures, having some form of mutual recognition of this, or having some forms of standardization or even exchange along those lines. This is the basic level of what we would think of as relatively common provisions that we find in these agreements. Then we have another set of level of agreements, and here we do tend to see some divergence between what we characterize as a European approach, which tends to be much more around having regulatory cooperation, exchange of information, and dialogue along certain areas, as opposed to a Asia-Pacific approach. I think oftentimes, sometimes people think of this as a U.S.-led approach, but we actually find many of these principles come out from Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, and others who are pushing these as well. And in some ways, the TPP chapter is a convergence of these types of ideas. But these are ideas around areas such as paperless trading, right? Mandating, for example, that there not be a paper copy along with a paperless copy, right? Recognition of certain types of model laws along the lines of what's been advanced by Multilateral and so on and so forth. So there is this layer. They tend to be more grouped across certain types of Asia-Pacific tends to have them more in a hard law type of format, whereas the European and others tend to take more of a cooperation type of format. And then there is the cutting edge issues. And so what is interesting, and for the sake of thinking about plurilateral going forward, right, the data issues, right, which Amy and Debbie and Jake touched upon, right, these are still relatively rare, right? You see this from Chorus to now TPP. You do see some of the TPP countries now bringing some of these principles now forward. So Japan, Mongolia has some of these elements. As Amy alluded to, Mexico, Panama now has some of these elements. So there is this idea diffusion, but this is still a relatively rare concept. And because other countries, not just African countries, right, think about, do we want to protect some flexibility in these forms of areas? And so I think the one interesting question to tee up, as I pointed out, there's heterogeneity on these types of issues, on source code, on privacy, all of these forms of issues. And it'll be interesting to see where we land, but there's still a lot of work. Even though the 60 plus can agree, let's continue talking. Where we wind up level-wise is going to be very, very interesting. One last point here. What about the 80 or so countries, right? It's actually less than 80, right, that haven't done anything along these lines, or the 100 or so that have stayed out of it. Other point that comes out from this research is not necessarily all of this comes from you're doing an agreement with the EU or with the US in large market access, and this is what you need to trade off. We actually find that some of the ideas diffusion comes from doing an agreement with Singapore or with Chinese Taipei or others, right, or Korea, where you start to do, this is where you start to learn how to think about what's in your e-commerce chapter interest, what's in your digital trade interest. And so this is a message that we have to say, right, this is not necessarily all being led by the big powers, but there is clearly a divide here in terms of who thinks rulemaking is important here and should be done through RTAs, and who's still touching upon, right, policy flexibility and so forth.
Thanks, Mark. Ambassador. So with all this heterogeneity and different approaches and different levels of topics, what's your take on our chances, if we commit this morning to initiate global discussions on this agenda? What do you see as the main issues, challenges? What's your take?
Thanks. And I think I'll just sort of take it back a step. I mean, I'm the UK's ambassador to the international organisations in Geneva, and there are 37, we think, at last count. So a whole range of different international organisations, including the World Trade Organization, but also including UNCTAD, including the World Intellectual Property Organization, the International Telecoms Union, the World Economic Forum, the Human Rights Council, etc. And one of the things that struck me, I've been there about 2.5 years, one of the things that struck me is actually that all of these organizations are having conversations about digital public policy making that actually have consequences for e-commerce and for digital trade, but they're doing it without actually understanding the unintended consequences of the conversations they're having. And the UK, sitting in all of these organizations, we decided that we would try and start bringing, at least in our approach, a sort of a consistency to how we addressed these digital public policy discussions that were going on in all of these organizations, to try and ensure that as digital has become something that all government departments, that all international organizations are thinking about, talking about, to ensure that they don't do things for good reasons in that particular area that have consequences for e-commerce and for the digital global platform and its potential into the future. And we were seeing, for example, there would be a resolution in the Human Rights Council on privacy online. There would be work on child protection online, for example. And all of these resolutions would basically be saying, one way or another, is we need to get our jurisdiction round the data so that we can apply online the laws that we apply offline. And that, in effect, was actually building up momentum behind data localization. And the UK was doing it as well. Our people who had come out from our Interior Ministry, worried about child protection online, would want to know how you can actually deal with this and how you can get sort of jurisdiction around this data. So we were building up all of these precedents in other international organizations that were basically moving us towards data localization. Whereas the UK, whenever we talked about data localization in e-commerce case, we were obviously against it. But large parts of our government were being pulled in that direction. So the first point is that actually there's a lot of sort of, if not rulemaking, then at least sort of public policy precedents being set that are affecting e-commerce. Apart from this, the unintended consequences of trying to do public policy online and what it means for data, the most important sort of multilateral rulemaking that affects e-commerce is, of course, what's going on in terms of internet governance. And actually the work that's done by WSIS and this thing called the Internet Governance Forum, which is meeting next week in Geneva, that and keeping the internet open and keeping its governance distributed rather than centralized in a single multilateral organization like the International Telecoms Union, that has actually, again, helped preserve the low cost to entry online and preserve the accessibility of the internet. So that's by way of sort of preface, I suppose, to what is it that we want to do in the World Trade Organization? What does the WTO add in value to what's going on elsewhere? And it does come down. To the rules on data, and it comes down to bringing into the WTO somehow, and I'll discuss what's been happening here this week, the best practice that's being developed in all of these different, both in these regional trade agreements, but also, there are, if I was going, the things that really will matter are things like the Privacy Shield agreement between the US and the EU. That has set sort of a set of key rules that will end up influencing this. The EU's General Data Protection Regulation that's going to be agreed next year, that will set the Europeans' view on how these rules should work internationally. And the sooner that it's brought into a multilateral context, the sooner we can ensure, instead of this heterogeneity developing internationally, a set of rules that actually continue to provide this common platform. And what I think has just been announced today, I think it's probably just happening just now, is that in the absence of an agreement, a mandate to take forward e-commerce multilaterally within the WTO, a group of countries has agreed to act, if you like, as a sort of coalition of the willing, a sort of vanguard group within the WTO to start developing what those rules might look like. A bit like something that was done about 20 years ago with telecoms regulation. There's something called the Telecoms Reference Paper in the WTO, which is probably a model for what we will now be doing in e-commerce. So it's a group of countries that have come together to take this forward. It's open to all members of the WTO. So it is, it's WTO friendly, multilateral friendly in that sense. But instead of no country being able to move forward unless every country agrees to move forward, you have countries moving forward and welcoming other countries to join them. And this initiative is led by Australia with Japan and Singapore. I think they have over 60 countries now supporting it. Their first meeting will be in the first quarter of next year. And that will be the place where, hopefully, we'll start bringing in the best practice from what's been happening either bilaterally or in terms of major markets like the European Union or the United States, or what's been happening in TPP, and bringing that into this discussion in the WTO so that you can provide a level playing field for all countries in the WTO. And we've been talking about Africa, Africa and the challenge of e-commerce in Africa. A lot of that is that there aren't clear, transparent rules that businesses can understand that allow them to actually trade into those countries using digital e-commerce platforms. If you have those best practice rules in the WTO and countries can then start voluntarily taking those rules and putting them into their services schedules, for example, in the WTO, then you start building the confidence that actually allows those markets that have been cut off from digital trade actually being able to join them. So you do have to bring this thing ultimately into a sort of a multilateral framework in order to really extend its benefits. And today, hopefully, we've actually agreed that we're going to take that forward. So I think it's a major development. In one sense, I think today will be seen as a disappointing day for the World Trade Organization, because in terms of a multilateral agreement, we've failed to get that. But in terms of actually setting the pathway for the future, in terms of more flexible negotiating function within the WTO, a sort of plurilateral function in the WTO that is also open to all the membership of the WTO, I think they'll look back on this agreement as actually a very important development.
Thank you. Can we take a few questions? Do people have questions you'd like to ask the panelists? Otherwise, we can continue the debate, but it would be interesting to hear from some of you, if you'd like. The floor is open. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Ady Beitler. I'm from South Africa, a member of parliament there. Just want to say that I agree fully with my friend from Senegal on the fact that Africa needs the technology sometimes a little bit more than the trade. But what we experience in Africa is a difficulty as well, is the costs of both the technology as well as the cost of the data. In my own country, we have a huge problem with many of the citizens of our country being unable to afford the costs of data. Don't talk about the technology. And therefore, you find that there is almost an inherent rejection of the technology, because the majority of people in the country where we endeavor to be democratic are having difficulty. And as politicians, we then have to make a decision based on the experiences of the citizens of the country. That's the one. The second point that I want to make is to emphasize the importance of capturing the trade value. It is of absolute importance to us to recognize and admit that for our fiscals, we are to a large extent dependent upon taxes, excise duties, as well as tariffs. And that helps with the operation of an effective state. And if that is a source of income that the state is deprived of, it is going to have very serious consequences for the operations of your African countries. Just the final point that I want to make is related to the question of the multilateral rules. I think that we would all agree on the need for rules, but I want to just proffer a proposal that it might be important that we ask these GAFA institutions to self-regulate, and for us as WTO to look at what it is that they are putting on the table and refining that a little bit more. It might be a more creative way of looking at the development of rules, but those rules are of paramount importance to ensure that there is general acceptance from a political perspective for what is already happening. It's not something that we're planning for the future. It's happening. And we need to look then, as WTO, at how do we ensure that whatever then is happening in this phase of economics is, in fact, not going to be detrimental to trade. Thank you very much, Chair.
Anybody else? Comments, questions? Go ahead. Yeah.
My name is Renato. I'm a university professor for Brazil. And recently, the EU-Japan trade deal was just finalized. And one of the issues that was not included on the trade deal was the question of data protection. It will even be discussed in parallel. Right now, I guess there is a member of the parliament in Japan discussing these issues. And for a long time, the trade deal was not finalized because of that. And when it comes to TPP language, when it allows for legit data transfer limitations for legit reasons and use the language of privacy, it only says that, privacy. It does not set anything else. It's a language that is too broad if we go to an European perspective. So I would like the opinion on the panel on how data protection rights could go into e-commerce and maybe free trade agreements and WTO clauses for that.
Thanks. Mark, that's one of the big three that you always talk about, right? Would you like to start? And then, of course, the rest of the panel can. But I know, Mark, you have a pretty defined position on this.
Yeah. So let me touch on this briefly, right? I think we see three different types of data types of provisions. And then, of course, most of the free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, don't touch on data at all, right? But the different forms that we have are TPP, and some would say TPP. Right? I think we heard Jake say TPP plus, right? Types of data provisions, right? We have others which touch on a more regulatory exchange type of. So there will be some discussion between the regulatory authorities on data types of provisions, right? And then others which are sort of more soft law types of principles, but recognize the importance of ensuring some data flows, but not necessarily quite as enforceable, but the language is in there as a building block. So on that point. To the point on South Africa, I think clearly, right, there are issues and thoughts about, right, do you need some form of an industrial policy, or can the market take care of itself on its own? But I'll just leave this thought with you, right? In 1998, I was an economist for the World Bank in China, right? It was very, very difficult to use an ATM to get any forms of payment. There was very difficult to get onto the internet, right? The number of people in extreme poverty, right, in the country, right, exceeded the number of people, total population of, right, Southern Africa, not just South Africa, right? You could not have imagined that 20 years later, right, this would be the leading country in the world, right, for e-payments, right, one of the leading platform players in the world, and in an ecosystem, right, that does not necessarily encourage open, free speech, right? Now, there's a political environment by which that is done, right? But the key parts I think people will emphasize there was a competition element on the backbone itself, right? Many of the costs of entry for the innovation for the local players, right, was because of the competition in the mobile markets, right? Because of the competition among some of the different banking sectors. And that was all done internally behind the border, but with implications from your GATT schedule. So I think there's a trade dimension, there's an industrial policy dimension to it, but there is, at the end of the day, also just the importance of market competition, of letting, right, innovators who have ideas, who are bright, allowing them to not be crushed by oligopolistic, entrenched, rent-seeking players. And so that's what I would have to offer on that point.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to take on? Yeah, of course, Amy.
Yes. just again to reinforce Mark's point, I think also if you look at NAFTA, and if you actually, one of the big effects of the basic telecom agreement in Mexico has been a huge decline in the cost of international phone calls. And this has had big benefits for migrants in the United States, for for remittances, for spreading the benefits of NAFTA in terms of personal mobility and mobility and the diffusion of industrialization, even to the poor in Mexico. Again, the key to all of this really is, I think, competition in basic telecommunications.
I would say on the issue of data protection, it's one of the reasons why you need a multilateral rule system, if possible, because Japan was put in a slightly challenging position where it had to deal with the TPP commitments, which are one way, and the EU, which goes a different way. And so how do you, and this comes up over and over again, how do you balance commitments that are different? It comes up in this issue on data, comes up in issues on standards, it comes up over and over again. The more that you could have multilateral rules, the easier it is for governments to navigate what could potentially be conflicting systems. So this would be, it's easier for governments to operate when we have multilateral rules or a multilateral framework that allows you to not have to deal with potentially conflicting challenges down the road.
Another question. I don't know whether you're talking about data protection in the sense of privacy.
Yes.
Data privacy, or whether it's like freedom of mobility of data.
Privacy.
But, so, for instance, freedom of mobility of data would include things like aggregated banking data or transaction data where the person doing the transaction has consented to the movement of the data. For data privacy, it's obviously data privacy regimes are different in different countries of the world. Some countries, some jurisdictions like the EU have a do it our way or don't do it at all, a fundamental position which can in fact be really trade stopping. And I guess what happened in the case of the EU-US negotiations was that both sides realized that this would completely stop trade if there were no recognition, and they realized they reached a mutually acceptable arrangement.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And let me ask Jake something.
A regulatory arrangement, that is, not really a trade agreement.
Let me ask you, Jake, and I don't know. Let's see how you react. So there are a lot of things going on at the FCC in the United States now about the regulation of the internet in general that has a lot of likelihood of affecting e-commerce. How do you think that this new stance is taking?
Charge certain users of data of the network more.
Yes.
I don't think the trade agreements dealt with this issue.
I don't think they did.
They didn't. There was a kind of mushy declaration in the Korea-US FTA about this, but that's as far as it went.
Yeah. Okay. So, but
we
will be talking about this a lot in the next months.
The answer is no effect on trade agreements because trade agreements didn't really deal with this issue in any binding way.
Okay. Do people have? Yes, there's a question at the
end. Felipe Sandoval from ICTSD. One question, rather technical, but you may make it evolve. What is the effect of negotiating rules on data flows under regional trade agreements on existing and perhaps future commitments under the WTO? There seems to be a debate there that it hasn't been fully addressed, but it is a technical debate and it's also a very political debate. Thank you.
Who would like to start?
Maybe I can.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, I think that we are facing a problem of today is to talk about data flows, data protection, and probably in 10 years we'll be able to have a kind of agreement. But in the meantime, what will happen is today the capacity of collection of data, because before protecting data, you need to collect it and own it. The capacity to collect data is not equally, it has not an equally repartition among the world. We know that the big player has a very strong capacity of collection of data. And that capacity of collection of data with the big data technology, intelligence, artificial, and so on, gives them the same way the capacity to stay and to dominate e-commerce, because they know exactly at what time you wake up, what are you drinking in the morning first, before you take your bath, and whatever. They know exactly your life. And knowing your life, they are able to sell you whatever they want. And I think that this is where the big challenge is. Discussing about the legal provision on data protection, privacy is an issue, but in the meantime, we have to give capacity equally to all the countries and stakeholders of the countries to also have a control of those data and to be able to use it. And this is why I'm saying that the government in developing countries has to be strategic, because their private sector has not the capacity to compete. So they need to be smart and to have some policy in order to have those data available and being able to have a local e-commerce with the value staying in the country. This is my comment on it.
So I mean, I guess on that point, and this, I'm sorry, doesn't get to Felipe's question as much, but you know, when I talk to small businesses in developing countries, I hear very different stories about the value of global platforms in enabling their business. There are, you know, Uber hasn't chased out local competitors who in some cases do it better in places like Santiago, Chile, and other places around the world. You know, Travelocity hasn't chased out walkanow.com, which was founded by a former University of Maryland student who went back to Nigeria and founded a travel platform based in Nigeria that is able to provide unique payment solutions where you can go to a bank, because not everyone has a credit card that can put into a system, and pay in installments at a bank for an online transaction that's routed out of Nigeria. Now, all of those companies still use global platforms to run their business on a global basis. I was surprised, actually, the extent to which small businesses around the world use Google, whatever it's called now, Docs and Sheets, Google Drive, in order to run their business. It's free software, and it enables a business to operate on a global basis. All these businesses use social media in order to market themselves to the world. I think just because these companies are global doesn't mean there isn't a tremendous benefit for companies and individuals in developing countries.
Let me take a stab at the question, though, to go back to the question. I think that it requires some flexibility. So let me just give you an example out of the TPP talks that comes to my mind. So one of the challenges that you have when you negotiate on e-commerce is consumer protection, right? So one of the big concerns that we have when we negotiate in RCEP, so 16 countries in Asia negotiating RCEP, is what do I do? And this question came up. I don't want to tell you how many times I've had to deal with this question with Asian negotiators. What do I do if I order a sweater and one sleeve is too long? Now, what do I do then? And okay, I don't know why this is an obsession in particular. I don't know how many people are wearing sweaters in ASEAN, but whatever, okay. If one sleeve is too long. Clearly, we need to have a number of things that happen, one of which is consumer protection rules, one of which is policies on returns, neither one of which do we have, but whatever. So the consumer protection is an important part of an e-commerce policy that you're going to have in place. But when the TPP was trying to talk about this, they ran into an obstacle, which is that Brunei, one of the TPP countries, has no offline consumer protection policies. They had no laws. So you can't require online consumer protection if the members don't have offline consumer protection. This is an obstacle. How do we solve this? The solution is less satisfactory than some would like, which was sort of slightly wishy-washy language that said, members shall endeavor to move in the direction, basically, of having online consumer protection. And that's the best you can do when not everyone has consumer protection laws. And in the meantime, do what you can to get Brunei to have both offline and online consumer protection laws. So I think flexibility is going to be key here, because you're starting with countries that have very different capabilities, very different starting places, very different commitments already in place, and I think flexibility is going to be absolutely critical if you want to build out an agreement that covers the largest number of countries from the beginning. You're going to have to be flexible, and you're going to have to accept that there are multiple ways to get to where you're headed. And the goal ought to be, from my perspective, in a multilateral setting, what can we do to enable e-commerce and digital services, or the digital economy, and then allow flexibility in getting there, because otherwise you're going to get stuck. You're going to have to say, well, that's the goal, and then how do we set in place, as much as we can, some kind of environment that allows us to make movement in that direction. And it will not be ideal for everyone. There will be some countries who are ahead of it, some countries who are still struggling to catch up. But that's where we want to go, and how can we make a framework that allows us to get there?
Can I offer just, this is almost an academic response to your question, Felipe, right? But I think the practical version to answering your question is, I would toss two questions back, right? Which is, I think the implication for the WTO is the membership is going to have to ask, how broad do we want this agreement to be in terms of whatever comes out of a working group discussion, and how quickly do we want this done? And the more data you bring in with hard principles, right, I would agree it would take longer, it'll be fewer, but it will also require more forms of variable geometry, right? And if you want to do something that touches on the data types of issues, but purely for e-trade facilitation along those lines, then at least the research that we suggest this would be faster, this would be broader, but it may not be politically palatable to some of the major powers out there. And then one last point on this is on the infrastructure elements, on the data science elements about this, right? These are behind the border issues. So these don't touch upon trade. The message that I think we see is that there are other trade-related elements, such as services openings, telecommunications, banking, financial services, that are part of this whole enabling ecosystem, right, which do touch on trade. So there's a sort of mix and match there.
Thank you. Are there more questions from? Yes, there is.
Thank you very much to the panel. I'd like to ask a question, but first preface it with a statement. I'm also from South Africa, Parliament, Trade and Industry. I think the one concern I'm having over this e-commerce conversation here is that it does appear to be more well-informed on the TPP side. And is that simply because you've marched ahead of everyone else? Or for what other reason is there? Because for one side of all the panels, I'm seeing more representatives on the panel from one grouping, if you want to put it that way, than from a grouping that hasn't yet enjoyed or hasn't yet started or even begun the e-commerce. Now, having said that, the point about capacity has already been raised. And this capacity, we know, is not simply a human capacity. It's, as has been referred to, an infrastructural capacity, etc. And when you have that kind of challenge, even if you then get the data and the technology, becomes a challenge to implement effectively. In Africa, with so many countries and the one continent, etc., all at very different points of development, some very developed, others not so developed, etc. How do we ensure that even on the continent itself, intra-African trade benefits from e-commerce? That's one aspect. The other thing is that e-commerce and data depends on wave bands and so on, and we all know what the situation is over the African continent. Who owns the airwaves? In fact, not Africa, not the African countries at all. It's owned by Europe and others. I mean, I know this from working with the astronautical industry, etc., that our waves are there over the Pacific, and others own ours over Africa. Those things have also got to be addressed, you see, while we all move into the digital age. We do want to move, but we want to move in a manner that doesn't further increase the gap that currently exists between the developing and the developed countries. We cannot afford that. That can only lead to a further deterioration of the efficacy of the World Trade Organization. So we want to, and you need to be able to put forward on the table some other information that will assist us in this regard. Thank you.
Who's the brave one?
We have another trade agreement in Asia that is also important. So RCEP brings together 16 countries in Asia with very diverse backgrounds. So we have Singapore with a per capita GDP of more than 50,000, and we have Laos and Myanmar, which, okay, this is being recorded, so I know my numbers are off, but I think it's less than 500. So we have incredible diversity also in Asia. All 16 countries are gathered together. They are negotiating a comprehensive trade agreement that does include e-commerce as one of the chapters. Now, it's been challenging, and it will not come out looking like TPP because, again, this is an incredibly diverse group of countries. But they recognize the importance of e-commerce, especially for their own small businesses, because they are all SME heavy. Every single one of these countries has somewhere in the neighborhood of more than 90%, as high as 98% of the businesses in each of the countries are SMEs. If you can't do something to help SMEs, then these countries cannot develop and grow. And one of the best ways for them to grow has been, at least recognized so far by the governments, the potential for e-commerce. In most of Asia, it will be mobile, because while we do not have the same connectivity issues that some of the other regions have, mobile devices have taken off in Asia, and most Asians have access to mobile devices. So this is recognized forward-looking. Even if not everyone has the device, not everyone can connect, this is the kind of forward-looking agreement that they need. So they're trying to create an integrated agreement that will provide a platform for e-commerce and digital services. But it is challenging. I mean, we're now 20 rounds into the negotiations on RCEP. Hopefully we will finish next year. It's been challenging. I'm not going to say that this has not been hard. It's been hard. And one of the things that's been very important for governments especially has been to put small businesses in front of government officials to say, in their own stories, their own languages, whatever, these are the things that we have to struggle with when we try to do business cross-border. And they're very practical experiences that they've had, because otherwise it's very hard for government officials to realize it's my small businesses that actually pay the price for difficult policies that we have. It's not just the big players from overseas who benefit. It's not just Alibaba who's going to clean up. It's also these small SMEs. So we talk about TPP because in the context here, we're trying to talk about what are some sort of path-breaking rules, but RCEP also may have some path-breaking rules, including some of the things that Jake talked about earlier, potentially some of the rules for small value shipments on de minimis, where we get some better rules that TPP didn't get. We may get in RCEP because the officials realize, I'm hoping, that SMEs need better rules for small size, small value shipments. That's what SMEs ship. Rules that are digital friendly for services players, some things that I think are more SME friendly on the RCEP side, but it's been challenging.
I'll add one point here, which is I think one interesting region that might be worth looking at is here in Latin America, right, where we certainly have more infrastructure challenges than has been the case in Asia, where less of the population is used on mobile, and certainly I think the one thing Asia has really leapfrogged ahead is on the payments solution. Been very creative about coming up, even within parts of Southeast Asia, right? The unbanked and finding ways to draw them on. But there are parts of Latin America. There's divergence on this continent, but there's certainly the Pacific Alliance countries have been very much engaged. If you look at just say the number of free trade agreements between countries in Latin America have some elements of e-commerce that are tied into it. Mercado Libre is a player here that is a platform player that was created indigenously and so forth. So it is possible for this to be done. And I will also add, I think one of the things that I've been doing as an academic has been working with the World Economic Forum and the WTO to run workshops at the WTO through various different groupings to take these elements, something as simple as e-signatures, and make sure that delegates understand what does that mean, what are the different varieties by which this could be addressed in a trade agreement, and how does that translate into on-the-ground issues for your SMEs and so forth. So it just encourage that, if you feel as though your delegation in Geneva or in Capital is not engaged in it, there certainly are resources for this to be done, and through regional training programs like UNECE and so forth, and others. So,
if they are given the time, if there are no, you guys, anyone have some closing?
I'll just make
remarks?
one closing remark. I would disagree a little bit with Julian. He's not here, so it's easier to do. He suggested, I think, that the front page story coming out of Buenos Aires is going to be pessimistic, that nothing got done. And,
yeah, he said that.
I would say I'm pleasantly surprised, and I think there is, the big story here is, assuming what Julian said is right, and this joint statement on e-commerce has been released, that's a huge deal. And that's a really important signal for how the World Trade Organization can operate effectively in the future. It's going to be increasingly difficult to get unanimous agreements on anything going forward. And I think that is one lesson of the ministerial here. But I think we should celebrate a victory, or celebrate at least a step forward. And that ought to be, we ought to take kind of a positive lesson from that.
Well, that's a good thing to end it on a happy note. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm from an NGO called Association of Professionals for the New Argentina. I have a question regarding net neutrality. I had to insist on that point. I think that sometimes when we talk about digital economy, we compress the debate on the issue of e-commerce, because it's the main driver of digital economy. When we talk about OTTs versus telecommunications or SAPs, the issue becomes a little bit more messier. And this repealing of net neutrality in the United States maybe is a deal breaker for some issues that we are discussing here. The divide between emerging economies and developed economies is important, of course, but there's also a divide between OTTs and SAPs, and the assemblies between each of them are different. For instance, African countries in the ITU versus ICANN issue or debate voted with the SAPs in 2011, and now we are facing a complex ecosystems in which maybe the idea of e-commerce as the main and only driver of the digital economy doesn't allows us to see what is coming with the repealing of net neutrality. I think you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on that issue of the OTTs, and because we're talking about e-commerce as a topic, as a driver for digital economy because of that data. But net neutrality and the fact that sometimes we don't trade goods but contents changes the picture. So I wish if you could elaborate a little bit more on that compression of the digital economy debate.
Okay. We have 2 minutes left in the panel. Does anyone?
Well, I would just say that it highlights the challenge of these sorts of topics, which are complicated and require people to be very precise. And we often do this in the digital e-commerce space. We smush stuff together where people are talking about one thing, but they're using the wrong terminology. You see it also, I would argue, in the privacy and security discussions where they're often smushed together. So someone's talking actually about privacy, but they mix it up with security, and they say that they're the same kind of thing. So I think it points to the need for further discussion and especially a lot more knowledge building so that we are very clear about what it is that we're discussing and we can split these terms apart. We don't have time at the moment to go into the difference between OTT services and non-OTT services, but this is the sort of technical level details that people actually do need to understand in order to have a productive discussion.
And just one word, which is that we haven't at all talked about content, internet content, and trade in content, which is actually a great area. I know there are direct offers of digital music from Africa. In fact, digital content is something that you can sell online with absolutely no cost other than your platform. But let's have a nice word for content, because content is what sustains the pipes.
Right.
Right? In ultimate, there are sometimes there are wars between the platform owners and the content providers, or between the data providers and the search companies and the content providers. Everybody ultimately has to get along and find a good balance because they all sustain each other.
Let's see if we do that if it happens that we have a global working group as of today. So thank you so much to the panelists. Let's give it a round of applause for everyone. Thank you so much for your perspective. And we'll continue with the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.